Welcome to this talk, which is part of the Inequality Conversation series being hosted by the Center for Public Policy at IIM Bangalore. Today we have a talk by Professor Venkatesh Panchapagesan, Venki as we call him. So Venki is an expert on real estate. He is chairperson of the Real Estate Research Initiative at IIM Bangalore. He also offers electives on real estate to the MBA students at IIMB. So there's no better person to tell us about inequality in the housing market. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Venki. Venki, over to you.
Thank you, Arpit, and thank you to Professor Sriram and the Center for Public Policy for having me here to give a talk on inequality on housing. Let me first share my screen. Just a little bit of background and also what my plan is for the evening. And first of all, good evening, and I hope I'm not going to spoil your evening today. My job here is to sort of highlight some issues related to inequality in housing. And more importantly, I want to throw some alternatives to what has been practiced so far. So what we will do today is I will first sort of give you a little bit of background of why housing matters. This has nothing to do with any sort of political or social angle to this. This is purely economic reasoning behind providing housing. And now I also will talk a little bit about the legal structure related to housing in India. Then I will move on to the state of housing. So we will talk a little bit about the housing history, how from the independence onwards till now, what was the degree of inequality in certain dimensions. Then we will also talk about what the plan is today. And also, more importantly, I want to highlight the different dimensions of inequality that you can think of in the housing context. And I'm going to mention a few, but focus on one. Then, of course, we will talk about the approaches different governments and have taken through policies and programs over time, and then finally, way forward. So this is just a rough set of the agenda. But before I jump in, I wanted to lay down a little bit of caveats that define this talk. First, this what I'm going to be presenting to you is not original work. My work is largely on the area of real estate. So this is more into areas that is not my direct research interest. But in the context of this talk, I was being able to collect a lot of information and also try to connect those information to what my understanding about the real estate markets are. So it is an assortment of work both globally as well as in India. The other thing I wanted to mention is, even though India is largely rural country and there is also a shortage of housing and inequality in the rural space, my focus will be on urban housing, more specifically in the cities that have really exploded in the last few decades. And I also, as I mentioned, even though there are multiple dimensions of inequality, I'm going to be focusing on the economic dimension of inequality. As I said, if I can highlight some structural issues in this space, then I think I might have, I will feel satisfied with this talk. So the first thing is sort of talk about the benefits of housing, which is unrelated to the social angle to it. So there have been multiple research globally which have looked at the benefits of housing to the individuals who live in that house, ranging from improvement in health outcomes. For example, people who have been provided more concrete structures, moving away from very informal settlements, have been found to have seen improvement in health outcomes. And if you believe that health outcomes cause two possible implications, right? One is It directly reduces the cost of managing health or the healthcare provision for the governments. And the other one is, as the health outcomes or the health improves for the individuals, their ability to produce for the economy also goes up. So, for example, lesser number of absenteeism and lesser number of days when they have to be sick and at home. So I think the health outcomes are, I think the research is very clear about that there is significant health outcomes that comes from proper housing. Following health, there is also research on the educational outcomes. This is maybe a little bit of endogeneity here, but by and large, what people have found is that when people get, again, let's say either a title to a land which is more secure or a better quality housing, then they do end up spending or investing in education. And that has much longer term impact, both to the households and to the economy. Similar to education, of course, if education improves, our livelihood opportunities also improve. But other than that, even with the first generation individuals in the household, even without educational outcomes, people do find that there is a greater sense or a greater access to opportunities. I mean, one simple channel by which it happens is that, for example, when you talk about land security, tenure security, in the absence of a tenure security, people would have to keep at least one or two individuals in the house all the time in order to make sure that that land does not get taken up by somebody else. So, for example, it is very common to have slightly older members of the household stay in the house all the time, just in case some action is taken or somebody else tries to come and encroach that land. But in the presence of a tenure, a secure tenure, then you don't need to have that, because you do have some notion of legal claims to that land that can be enforced separately. So this again has been shown in globally. Similar to that, also access to credit. Largely, land is a collateral asset. So if you do provide them with secure ownership of both land and the structure on the land, people can monetize that. Individuals and households can monetize that, and that directly helps them in their businesses or any sort of immediate need for credit. And of course, land and housing does provide social security. In the absence of any government schemes, the land does provide one of the most important social security for majority of the country. So again, these benefits have been well documented globally. From an Indian context, research is sort of mixed. I mean, for example, one of our own, my own paper on land tenure security, we don't find many of these things happening. Again, we don't know whether it's a quality of the data issue or whether it is to do with certain state of evolution in the land markets. But by and large, I think we need more research in India to be able to demonstrate that these sorts of outcomes are also possible in India. From a macro perspective, clearly, real estate, construction, housing is a very large employer, both directly and indirectly. For example, in India, construction-related activity and real estate is the second largest employer after agriculture. So it is a significant job-creating mechanism for the economy, and therefore it is very important that investment in housing is taken up in a very serious way, especially in a country like India, where job creation has been very anemic at best. The other important element of the macro effect of real estate is the multiplier effect. which again, for every dollar of investment in the sector, you do find a multiplier to the GDP or to the economic output. In India, roughly the last, which was done about a decade and a half back, it puts that number to be something like 0.78. So for every rupee or dollar invested, at least 0.78 comes back immediately as an increase in output. So it is therefore a very important sector from a government perspective, from a macroeconomic perspective, to nurture and take care of. And of course, the last part is, the individuals having structured housing, it improves their stake in the community, both physically and emotionally. And therefore, for example, there has been some research where people are being able to get together because of the community aspect and take care of certain things like crime, for example, monitoring crime and preventing crime and so on. So I think in general, giving ownership or giving direct stakes through housing has both individual as well as larger economic benefits. So, and the reason I brought this up is that, even if we don't have a political or a social reason for providing housing to a large number of people, there are so many other benefits for which government should seriously think about providing housing in a big way. So, having given the benefits, now I want to look at more the legality of housing in the country. So, most countries have adopted this Universal Declaration, which was the United Nations post World War II, where it was explicitly called out for right for a good standard of living for all citizens. And India, of course, wanted to adopt it, and they started with providing the right to property as part of the fundamental right, which is enshrined. Of course, as you know, fundamental rights have a much higher bar, and they are more seriously protected by the courts. We had two significant parts of the Constitution that protected those rights. One was on the eminent domain aspect, which is to say that if you own a land, a private ownership of land cannot be taken in an arbitrary way by the government. And there has to be some due process that needs to be followed, and fair compensation has to be provided in case it is taken for a public purpose. And the other part of it is just purely the right to acquire, dispose, use property without somebody else coming in and disturbing that or preventing you from doing that. So these two were fundamental rights when we started after independence, but somewhere in 78, in the wisdom that only courts know, they moved to constitutional rights from fundamental rights. So which meant that there is a slightly lower bar now, but still the right to property is considered to be one of the more exclusive rights that the government provides to its citizens. There have been multiple legal or litigations on testing these aspects of the Constitution, and I'm just going to highlight one landmark case, which was Rajesh Yadav versus State of the UP, which was about right to shelter being a fundamental right, which is, of course, as we just saw. And more importantly, the poor and landless have the right to residence even if they are sitting on an encroached property. And this was very explicitly called out by the Supreme Court in this case, and of course this followed through with multiple other cases. And the idea behind it is that the states have some responsibility to provide housing to its citizens, especially the ones who are economically weaker. But the cases have also highlighted, they are very nuanced in most places. They've also highlighted the fact that the right to shelter does not mean the right to land. So which meant that in case there is an encroachment, then the Supreme Courts have also allowed governments to take action, provided, under certain conditions. And of course, some cases, the courts have also upheld that the government is not obliged to build housing, but to provide some sort of a shelter where, it could be through subsidies to financing, but it is not a responsibility. So in a nutshell, what you have is that there is a right to shelter and there is a right to property, but different cases have brought out different aspects to it. It is just that there is no direct responsibility, which is what the original UN resolution was planning to put on the governments, that they do have a direct responsibility to provide housing to its citizens. So while the constitution had some of these sort of limitations in providing housing to the citizens, there is also another complication that is brought in by the responsibility that the constitution had laid on the states versus the center. So for example, as related to housing, the center is responsible for formulation and implementation of social housing schemes. And it is also responsible for acquiring land for these large projects which cut across states, and therefore land acquisition through this eminent domain would come under the center's responsibility. Outside of this, everything else largely would be part of the state's list, including housing, provision of urban development, infrastructure at the local level, land revenues, and things like that. So in other words, what happened is that because we have a federal structure, the policies do get implemented or even brought in a very, it is not homogeneous. So some states have taken lead, some states have lagged severely behind. Even in the enforcement of some of the central schemes where the center is actually happy to fund the creation of housing, some states have taken more ownership of that and taken lead in creating housing, while some other states have decided not to do anything about it. So in other words, because we don't have that top-down structure, there is inequality that just comes naturally from the way the rights and responsibilities are divided between the center and the state. So this is the context. The context is that housing in general is valuable to the economy. So there is a clear economic motive for governments to promote housing in a big way, to make sure that everybody has good quality shelter. And then also there is a legal structure that do provide some protection to that. But by and large, we don't see that being by and large, what we see is that there's a large number of citizens who have either no housing or substandard housing. And that's the focus of this talk for me, to be able to highlight the magnitude of this problem and also come up with the approaches that governments have taken and some of the limitations of those approaches. So in terms of inequality itself, since the talk is about inequality in housing, you can actually look at inequality in multiple ways as far as housing is concerned. For example, we can look at inequality through income lens. For example, people who are economically behind versus people who are richer part of the economy. There is also inequality by religion and caste in India. So for example, even keeping income constant, you do find that people of certain religion, certain caste tend to be provided with substandard housing, or they may have lesser access to housing. There is also a gender inequality. Clearly, women own much lesser proportion of housing, and I think there are we do have Professor Hema, who's an expert in gender inequality. So gender itself, in fact, a lot of government policies have tried to eliminate some of those gender inequality by ensuring that some of their policies are only catering to housing if women are termed as the owner of the house. So it is only meant for women owned housing, but still, as you can see from the actual data, women ownership is still significantly lower in India. There is also inequality by disability. Again, the access to housing, some of the housing itself, even though the current building code requires most housing to be disability friendly, but we do find that that is not the case. And of course, recently, sexual orientation is another angle by which you can look at the inequality. But we are not going to look at all of them. There is also inequality in the quality of ownership, which is, for example, two people owning houses might have different security of tenure just because of any of these, whether it's a caste or whether it's gender and so on. And also inequality can be by the type of habitability. And this is where the gentrification arguments come in, where many of the predominantly low-income neighborhoods have been converted to high-income neighborhoods, pushing the low-income further and further out of the city. And this is a global phenomenon. And India is also seeing some of that, especially in states like Maharashtra, where slum redevelopment, in the name of slum redevelopment, a lot of gentrification is happening. So I'm going to define just in terms of focus for us. As I mentioned earlier, we will be looking largely from an economic lens. For that, we need to define what is affordable housing and how do you ensure that people have at least an affordable house. In general, there have been many attempts to define it, and most of them end up defining it in three dimensions. One is the income, and one is the size of the unit, and the third is the affordability to the household. So in the case of, in India, Deepak Parekh committee in 2008 was first to put that down in a very structured form. They defined EWS, which is economically weaker section, to be 30 square meters or less, which is roughly about 330 square feet. The cost from an income point of view is that the unit should not be priced more than 4 times the household income annually. And then the servicing of that, whether it is an EMI or a rent, should not exceed 30% of their monthly outflow, a monthly income. So in other words, if there should not be any disproportionate servicing because of ownership of housing. And so that's what was defined for economically weaker section. And of course, LIG, which is low income group, medium income group, similar definitions was adopted. So this sort of gave a sort of a threshold for governments and financial institutions to start looking at promoting affordable housing. But having said that, there was a study in 2020 by Tiwari and Rao, who were trying to look at the data and capture what is the actual affordability status by different income groups. So if I can ask you to focus on those blue bars. So what you see is, what we are capturing is the ratio of the housing price to the income of the household in that category based on actual sampling of households. And as you can see, as you get to the lower end of the income spectrum, the blue bar spikes up. So which is basically saying that in actuality, the house prices have gone out of hand relative to the income, making it extremely unaffordable for many of these segments. Even if the house is available, it is available at a price that they just cannot afford. So from a definition point of view, these are not affordable housing based on the prices that are in the marketplace. I just want to mention that even there have been some studies on caste religion, even though that's not our focus. I'm not going to spend time on that, but basically the research has shown that by caste religion, there is significant inequality. By gender, there is significant inequality. And also there is a disproportionate percentage of, for example, Dalits living in slums compared to compared to other categories. And so this is again showing that inequality exists in multiple dimensions. And as was mentioned earlier, right, that because these different states have enforced some of these in not a uniform way, you do find that housing conditions in general vary as well. And people have found that they do vary by income of the state, which is not surprising, but it is even more now a reason that if some of the poorer states tend to have the greater percentage of population in the low income category, then you do have a problem that not only they are probably not provided houses, but their housing conditions are also quite poor compared to their richer state counterparts. So now I'm going to start focusing on the housing shortage by the different income category. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the government approaches to solve that problem. So what you are seeing here is the result of the first detailed study to capture housing shortage in India. And here the focus is on urban housing shortage. And this was a committee that was constituted by the parliament. And they came up with a number of 18.7 million units. And this was the shortage as of 2011. And what you're seeing here is that out of that, a big chunk of it is in constitute housing where people are congested. There are more people staying in the house than what is desirable. Some of them are in kacha housing, so which meant that these houses have structural problems. Some of them are in obsolete houses. So in general, if you look at it, majority of the shortage comes from people living in substandard or no housing. And then within the income category, a big chunk of it comes from the economically weaker sections of the society. So if you take the low income group and the economically weaker section, pretty much about more than 90% of the shortage comes from these two categories. So this is a very significant number. And for the first time, this number was put out both for the overall country and by the individual states. And so this obviously resulted in several government policies that were, that were targeted towards trying to fill this gap. So recently, a lot of consulting firms have tried to extrapolate that shortage to 2022 and going forward. And the reason 2022 was very significant, it was because of one important government policy called Housing for All. And we'll talk about it in a second. So that Housing for All was a very bold move by the government to try to resolve this housing crisis by 2022, as you know, which happens to be the 75th anniversary of our independence. And unfortunately, we are not there yet. So now the goalpost has changed a little bit. But by and large, as you can see, that 19 million unit shortage has now been translated now to 44 million shortage. Of course, this is quite a very radical change. The government's estimate itself is another 10 more million. But by and large, we can say that, another let's say half of this number, about 13 to 14 million, would have been an additional need from 2011 to 2022 as urbanization happened. Of course, this is urban. People have also looked at rural as well, but we are not going to look at it for the time being. But as you can see, over time, the housing shortage has exponentially gone up along with urbanization. And as urbanization increases, you do find that there is a significant number of shortage. So from a rough, even if you take some linear projection here, roughly what you're seeing is that something like for every percentage increase in urbanization, you need an additional 3 to 3.5 million units to be created for the new population that is going to come into these cities. So which means that, for example, the government's own projection is that there would be 60% urbanization from the current 37%. So which means that something like a 25% increase in urbanization would translate to an additional 75 million units to be needed by 2050. So you're seeing that there is a lot of need from existing population, because a lot of housing would have gotten obsolete or would need repairs and renovations. And then on top of it, as new people come into the city, there is going to be a greater need for building units. So this is a significant challenge for any government, forget about just Indian government, to be able to create this much of supply in a rapid time period, because the urbanization is happening. So from a government's perspective, when they started soon after independence, as we all know, a lot of it was a little bit socialist in nature. So which meant that the perception of housing was more as a welfare good, and therefore the government provided subsidies for people to own houses. And for the lower income category, the government was the single largest supplier of housing across states, across the center. So as we said, right, government is responsible for provision for social housing schemes. So most of the time, the final provider of housing would be the state and its agencies, but it will be mostly funded by the central through the center's budget. And there were multiple schemes that had come out, but as the 1950s and 60s happened, there was a recognition that government cannot continue to become the only supplier of housing, low-income housing, and therefore there was a greater push to bring private parties to get involved in the housing. And this largely was the approach that the central governments took in the 70s and 80s. So rather than subsidies, there was a push towards cost recovery. So at least people should pay something for their housing. There were structural institutions like HUDCO, which was supposed to be financing the creation of housing stock in the country. The National Housing Bank, which was created for refinancing, as well as providing capital to many of the housing finance companies. And of course, the largest housing finance company, HDFC, was created during this time. And therefore, there was a whole lot of policies that were created over time. The interesting part is this approach of government to try to solve this problem continued as the shortage kept increasing, as we saw in the earlier slide. From 2000, the housing shortage was only increasing over time, and I would think that the earlier numbers were probably underreported because of the fact that there were no significant central exercise which was common across states. So each state was measuring things in a different way. Post-liberalization, the focus was entirely that government cannot do any of these things, it can only be an enabler. So the focus was to provide the conditions for private sector to jump in and start creating the housing stock. And this is where my fundamental issue with the approach was, even though it was the right call at that time that governments were financially stretched, they could not provide housing, they could not lay down that capital need for the housing. But at the same time, some of the enabler incentives were not enough for the private sector to take this up in a serious way. And we will talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to focus on the PMAY, which is the Prime Minister Awas Yojana, which was started in 2015 by the current administration, which was more as an extension of what was there earlier as Jawaharlal Nehru Urban Renewal Mission, which was JNURM, which had brought in the concept of incentivizing states to take up housing so that the central government can use financial incentives to motivate states to take up the housing shortage. And the same approach was taken by the PMAY as well. As I said, in 2015, it was a very bold call to eliminate housing shortage by 2022. Now the government has extended to 2024. So the core elements of this vertical of this scheme, there are four different approaches. One is for redevelopment of slums, where the incentive it's a financial incentive to people who are already in slums to be able to get together and create better quality housing. There is a credit-linked subsidy scheme, which is what most people talk about when they talk about PMAY, which is largely an incentive to the borrowers to be able to get some subsidies in the interest rates for borrowing towards buying housing. Then there are these other two verticals, which are affordable housing in partnership, as well as the beneficiary-led construction. Both of them essentially wanted the private sector to take it up, whether it's individual households or real estate developers, to take it up, and the incentives were very, very marginal. So in a way, for example, in the beneficiary-led construction, the beneficiary's stake or in the investment was somewhat greater than 50 to 60% in order to even qualify for the benefit that the government was providing. So clearly, as you can see, that many of them are already living hand to mouth. So there was no way you are going to get a huge number of people adopting to this particular vertical. So very not surprisingly, except for the credit-linked scheme, all the other schemes have been very slow in their adoption. So the performance has been not so great. For example, there's only some 30 lakh houses that have been created. As you can see, the shortage was 18 million or 18 lakhs, even at the time of in 2011 itself. But the extra the amount of motivation that was given to get people to either improve the quality of their housing or seek financial or seek loans to buy new housing. Most of the lower income groups had not benefited. So much of the houses that were generated through PMAY ended up being in the higher income categories. And that's one of the failures of the scheme, that the scheme was able to expand the definition of affordability to include even, for example, houses which are 50 lakhs and above. So in other words, this is clearly not meant for low income housing. It's meant for more like middle income housing, middle or upper middle class. So that's in a way that taints some of the performance of this PMAY. So I'm going to, and of course, the PMAY being a central scheme, there have been a lot of state schemes, and the performance of the state schemes have been very similar to PMAY. The schemes have been announced in grandeur, but not much output has come through. For example, in Karnataka, in 2016, a 1 lakh housing scheme program was announced. Only 2,000 houses have been ready by 2022. Even within PMAY, as I was talking about the slum redevelopment, only a very limited percentage of Karnataka slum board's interventions have been converted to proper housing, even within the vertical that was provided under PMAY. So let me talk a little bit about the fundamental problems as I see it, and this is where some of the things that I'm going to talk about are a little bit controversial. So the first thing is in the provision of affordable housing, which meant that this is something that is going to enormously help the lower income category. The first problem is the availability of land, and the fact that the land, which first of all, it's not available, but even if it is available, the cost of the land is exorbitant because of the uses of land that the developers can think about, which is not related to affordable housing. So I can give you examples from my experience with working with developers that almost every developer would look at affordable housing as their last priority. So if they can build something else, they would build that. And that's a fundamental issue, which is really what is restraining the supply of housing in this space. On top of this, given that already people are not lining up to build housing, the government also makes it very, very difficult through a very inefficient approvals process. For example, even today, after so many years, there is not a single window clearance for affordable housing projects. So you still have to go through multiple agencies to get some of the clearance, and every approval takes time, and time is money for most of the developers. So most of the private developers that the government is actually relying on to build the stock, they are not incentivized through this approval process mechanism. And this is at the state level. Of course, there is also very incongruous zoning and development norms. For example, some of the states have innovated by providing higher floor space index or FSIs. So if you build affordable housing, they will provide you with some additional or a relaxation of zoning requirements so that you can build more somewhere else. And, and this has been used by the developers, but not enough to be able to make them produce the supply in a big way. And this is something that the provision of infra for distributed development, which means that if, for example, one possibility that the governments can take is that rather than look at creating houses within the city, they can look at creating houses outside the city and then have excellent transport mechanisms to bring people in, which is the model that China has adopted in a big way. So obviously land is cheaper outside, the infrastructure cuts down the time for commute, and people are happy to stay far away. In India, what has happened is that many of the affordable housing projects have been pushed to the outskirts because of the land cost. But in the absence of poor infrastructure, the economic livelihood gets impacted in a big way. And therefore, most people, even though affordable housing stock is being created outside the city, nobody wants to go there. So many of the affordable housing projects, for example, in states like Gujarat, they are actually lying vacant or they're being used for some other purposes. And the people continue to live in very poor or poor quality housing within the city. There are also limited incentives for developers, both in terms of taxation as well as financing incentives. I'll mention a little bit about the taxes here. The other thing for many of the developers is that the business model of building houses, where whether you're building an affordable housing or whether you're building a regular housing, you still have to rely on cement, steel, and some of the inputs which are sensitive to economic shocks. And as you know, in the recent times, the commodity prices have gone up. So if the cost of building goes up or cost of construction goes up, and in the case of a regular housing, the developer has an option to pass it on through price increases. But in the case of affordable housing, they cannot, because of the fact that many of the affordable housing provisions or even the affordable housing incentives are provided under the assumption that the price does not go beyond a certain level. So in other words, that risk from the input shock will have to be borne entirely by the developer. So this also makes it very unattractive for large number of private developers to come into this space. And then there is a quality issue, which is just like many of the affordable housing projects are also high-rise in states like Maharashtra. But because the maintenance of some of that structure, for example, lift in a large high-rise affordable project, if the lift does not work, then it becomes extremely difficult for people living in high-rise to be able to take advantage of their housing. So in very interestingly, in India, there is a floor premium for regular housing because people want to get the view. But when you go to affordable housing, there is actually a floor discount. For most people, the premium is in the ground floors or lower floor level units as opposed to the higher floor units, which again just shows that even though you can create that stock, but if you're not following through with the maintenance part, if you're not thought through the maintenance part of it, then it might throw some unintended consequences into the decisions of households. In terms of taxes, whether it's affordable or not affordable, there is a significant chunk which are dedicated to various types of taxes. Roughly about 25% of a housing price goes towards taxes. It could be a little bit higher or lower depending on the state. And this is another huge disincentive. So if the governments are really serious about building affordable housing stock using private developers, then clearly they need to do something about bringing down this, because this 25% directly goes into the price. And therefore that makes the house unaffordable for that income category. So clearly this is an area that government should be focusing on in a big way. So I'm going to move, I don't know how much time we have. I'm going to, Arpit, do we know how much time?
You can carry, maybe 5-10 minutes and then we'll open up for Q&A.
Yeah. So I'm going to move to some of the interventions and some of my thoughts on this. Largely, as we have seen in the past, the governments have taken either a demand side or a supply side intervention. The demand side would be largely by either providing funding or reducing the prices to make houses more attractive. And I have to say that at least from the data that we have been able to gather, the demand side interventions as far as affordable housing categories go has been very, very poor. So which means that even, for example, if most states have either eliminated stamp duty on affordable housing. This is a transaction tax. So whenever some household goes and buys from a developer, they will have to register, and at that time they'll have to pay a stamp duty. So most states have either eliminated or kept it very, very low. And from our data, we have not been able to see any impact of reduction of taxes like this or reduction of prices through stamp duty, because the very nature that the prices are so so unaffordable that a small change here and there is not going to make a significant dent to the demand. And therefore, the biggest thing is to bring supply at a reasonable price in a big way. So therefore, the supply side interventions are in my mind, a lot more critical in India than the demand side interventions. So in the supply side, for example, the governments recently have done a few things. One is they have provided the priority sector lending status to the affordable housing sector. So which means that people can borrow, the developers can raise construction financing at a much lower rate. Similarly, they are also allowed to borrow overseas. Income tax has been completely waived for a certain period of time if you are an affordable housing project, and so on. So by and large, a lot of these things are in the right direction. But as I mentioned to you, it is still not enough. For example, on the income tax, right? I mean, I was been talking, we have actually done a little bit of survey with developers, is that many of them, the profitability on these affordable housing projects is anyway extremely low. So which means that if you're talking about a very low profit base, any income tax waiver is going to be an insignificant motivation for developers. So clearly that's something that has not excited them to jump into this. Similarly, the affordable housing, the financing part of it. So even though, as I said, the financing is an important cost component for a developer, the bigger component is the cost of raw materials and inputs. And there, the government has not done much in trying to protect the developers from these economic shocks. So clearly, many of these are good policies, but at the end of it, what you're seeing is that they are not at the margin enough, strong enough to motivate a large number of private players to start creating the affordable stock. So now coming back to the land part, so construction is one important component. A typical project, the land cost will be a significant component. For example, if you take states of Maharashtra or Bombay, the land cost will dominate the construction cost. While if you take some place like Bangalore or some other cities, you're talking about land cost being about a third or a little bit more than a third of the total cost of construction for a project. And again, this is only when the land can be optimized through these floor space index, which is for a given unit of land, how much of built environment can you create? So this floor space index is direct ratio, and so if developers are allowed to optimize on that, then you do have an ability, you do have some potential to get developers excited to build affordable housing stock. But the part is still the land is not available to them. So they have to go to the private markets to acquire land. And this is where the land markets have made a huge effect on pricing, right? So for example, most cities, the prices, in fact, India is about 4 or 5 of our cities rank among the most unaffordable cities as far as housing is concerned globally. So, and part of it is because the land costs have shot up like crazy. So in this respect, the only way if we can create a huge amount of affordable housing stock to address this need has to come from government land. And in fact, not just the government land, the agencies that are related to the government, for example, in Bangalore, I mean, when you drive through Kormangla, you'll be looking at it and saying, why do you need an army cantonment in the middle of the city? It used to be outside city once upon a time, but now you have huge amounts of land held by government agencies in cities which could be repurposed for creating affordable housing. So if the land is available, made available to developers through long-term leases, where only the cost of construction then falls on the developer, then there is some potential to keep the pricing of affordable housing at a reasonable level within cities, which can create a huge economic impact in the country because of the fact that if so many people get better quality housing, and as we saw, the outcomes can be quite good. So I'm going to throw this controversial part here, which is when I look at land use in India, as you know, the agriculture dominates our single biggest land use. For example, almost a little bit less than half of our land is in agriculture, and the urban centers constitute only about 2% of the land that's available in the country. So which means you have, in fact, India is the second largest holder of agricultural land, even more than China. And we produce significantly less output. So on the one hand, obviously, you cannot take away agricultural land without providing alternatives. And there are certain agricultural land which are rich and needs to be protected. But on the other hand, the fact that when you are focusing on urbanization, and when you need urbanization, and as you can see, the impact of urban centers on economic future of the country is very significant, right? Like agriculture with that kind of land produces an impact of 14% of GDP, while industry produces 68%. Again, I'm not saying that we should blindly move, but the fact of the matter is we need to optimize our agricultural land and make some of that land available. So right now in most cities, the agricultural land gets repurposed for development in a very ad hoc way. And that itself is the cause of most of our problems. But at the end of it, what you need is a very systematic policy to be able to take some of that land and repurpose it. And I'm going to give you an example using some estimate that the FICCI had put out. So in other words, what they said was there would be another 900 million new entrants into the cities by 2050. And again, this is just one estimate. And I thought, let's try to work a back of the envelope calculation on how much land do you need for that many people. And just based on certain assumptions on how much area people need, looking at how much floor space index that can be provided, what I'm getting is the land that you need to build housing for these new entrants is about 0.6 million hectares. If you add to that the existing shortage, it roughly is about 0.75 million. It's still less than a million hectares. And what you have in agriculture is 152 million hectares. So the affordable housing need, if you really want to solve the problem, I mean, all this ad hoc of trying to get private players to build, to buy land in the public, in the open markets and then create affordable housing, it is not working. You need to inject a huge amount of land in order to solve this problem. And the only player who has that kind of land would be the government, or the land can be provided by the government through its policies. So if you then take the government agencies, and this is what this is one of my pet peeves with the government, is that even without agriculture, if you take all the government land, I mean, lands with government agencies like airports, ports, defense, and we are talking only about surplus land. And these are surplus land as indicated by the agencies to the parliament. And it very interestingly, all these defense and other agencies stopped reporting post 90s. After they realized that this is causing them more, more attention. People want to grab that land. But if you look at the surplus land that the defense and others had indicated in the 90s, about 1/4 of the land that we need is already with them. So which means that, and this is only surplus land, so which means that there's a lot of land that can be brought into the market by the government in a big way. And if you look at the funding need, that's where the problem is. So the land can solve a big problem, but the other problem is the cost of construction and who is going to finance it. And this is where the private markets can come in a big way. People like National Housing Bank, HUDCO, they are capable of creating securitizations to make that funding available for this once land is made available. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the global strategies, and then maybe I will stop. So obviously, there's providing shelter to low income is there for every major country. China, for example, of course, their political structure is quite different. As I mentioned to you, they had taken an infrastructure-driven model, which meant that by providing connectivities, they were able to expand the size of the market and made people commute, and then also take up low-priced housing at a farther out place. The other thing that they have done very interestingly is that they have mandated employers to provide housing, which used to be the case in India in the 50s, where there was a lot of incentives given to industries to create low-income housing. But then over time, that has sort of gone away. But in China, that's a big part of the policy. And also, they also provide direct subsidies for people to rent. So they provide rent subsidies. So in other words, a lot of existing structures can be repurposed for renting rather than owning, because a lot of issues come up when ownership is considered, because in which case the ticket size, the size of capital all becomes quite high for the low income households. But rent can be managed provided they can be supplemented by a subsidy. So for example, when you're talking about 5,200 rupees per month rent, when the total rent is about 9,000, 10,000, so then it becomes a significant sort of a play where people can afford to even look at housing that would have otherwise not been made available. In Mexico, they did a very interesting thing on the supply of materials, which is what I was telling you earlier. The inputs to the construction, they were able to try to reduce the cost by creating some platforms that provided scale benefits, and through that, people who are building affordable housing could buy these things at a much lower cost. There are other models. I'll skip that. So essentially, what I wanted to talk about is, when you think about solving this policy, aside of the fact that the government should keep consistent policies, and I'll give you an example from a case, a developer who mentioned this to me, that when they started an affordable housing projects, GST was at some percentage, and then somewhere in the middle, because the project was not complete, the GST rates were suddenly hiked for affordable projects. So which meant that halfway through the project's viability suddenly became quite bad for the developer. So now the developer is seriously thinking, should I continue or should I just stop? So these are things where, the government, by maintaining a consistent policy and saying that it only impacts future projects that start or launch after that date, would have solved this problem. But clearly that has not happened in the case. And this is not just one policy. There's several policies where governments had been either changed things retrospectively or being inconsistent. The guarantees can be used both at the input level as well as at the credit level, where, for example, some of the affordable housing projects, the government can provide first loss guarantees. It has happened in the past. Today, the government does it for distressed housing. So this is a case where the developer has really bailed out. Then you are trying to provide first loss guarantee for the new players. So it kind of one would wonder, why wouldn't you wait for the developer to default and then provide this incentive? Why don't you do it beforehand? So these are things that where the governments, by thinking in a slightly more creative way, can eliminate some of these issues that are currently affecting the market. And then on top of it, we have I think all of you would have seen this demolition of huge towers in Noida. In fact, if you think about it, why? I mean, this is a place that has already been built. You've already, if you want to penalize the developer, there is a better way. Take this house and give it to affordable housing, and get a whole lot of people who could not afford a house to live in this, and make the developer pay for that. So, in other words, rather than demolishing a structure which has already taken enough capital, and you have a huge need for housing, even though I understand the moral hazard story and the arguments for this, clearly the governments can think in a different way. They should be able to come up with some creative strategies. So finally, I would want to leave with a slide that while the governments have been trying hard from 1947 to address housing inequality, I guess finally nature is showing how to do it. So as you see, some of these upmarket villas are looking the same way as some of the slums. The only difference is that the former is getting a lot of press while the latter is accepted. This is how it would be. Okay, so now I'm happy to take some questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Venki, for a very interesting and also thought-provoking presentation. I mean, the idea that we could use agricultural land or we could have repurposed the Noida towers. I like the title on your slide which just said why. Why are we demolishing this? But so I can see we have a couple of questions already from the audience. So if the audience members on Zoom want to ask questions, I'll request you to just raise your hand. I'll allow you to unmute and ask the question yourself. If people are on YouTube, please send in your questions to cpp@iimb.ac.in. So we have one question from the audience who's on Zoom. Kuratulana, I've allowed you to unmute. If you can hear me, you can directly ask your question.
Okay. Am I audible?
Stop share. Yeah.
So basically, my question was regarding the rental market. So since we are seeing such a huge demand, so maybe building the houses for each with ownership may not be a very feasible option. So and mainly right now the even rental housing market is mainly market driven. So my question was that how can a government regulate this rental housing market, ensuring that the quality of the housing doesn't fall? Because in various state tenancy acts and regulations that were passed which prevented the threat of eviction, in that gradually over a period of years we could notice a fall in the quality of housing. So how can government regulate the housing market while ensuring the quality of housing? This was my first question. And second is basically when we are talking about access to credit, so that more people are can access the housing. So when we see the lower income group is the major population which lack access to housing. And such a population belongs more to the informal sector of the economy also, with unstable income in place. So in such a scenario, how can the access to credit be designed so that this sector of population can have the access to credit?
Great, great questions. Thanks for asking. Let me address the first one, which is the rental housing. See, the rental housing, a lot of people look at rental housing as some sort of a magical solution to the problem that we have, right? But really, somebody has to create the rental housing in the first place. Somebody has to put capital and create that. And therefore, that investment, whether it is going to be rented or going to be occupied, would be the same at the end of the day. So which means in order to create rental housing in the first place, we have to incentivize the person who is going to do that. So as of today in India, the rental yields are one of the lowest in any of the G20 countries. If you take G20 as a sort of a base, or even if you compare it with SARC nations, the BRICS nations, our rental yields are quite low. So which means if I am investing 100 rupees in building this house, I'm not able to get enough as rent to even compensate for the cost of capital that I have. So in that way, the rental housing stock itself actually in India has declined over time. So this is again coming back to where is the cost coming from? The cost comes majority from land as well as the building cost. So the land cost, if the government can actually repurpose some of their land and say, look, here is some land that belongs to, let's say, a public sector unit that is not doing very well. Can we take that land, lease it to a developer or lease it to some agency who can create that house and then rent it out and then create that sort of a rental housing stock? This is what, for example, many countries follow what is called a social rental housing policy. And in fact, there are a lot of institutional investors who come into this to own this. So the only problem in India is that while the institutional investor might find it very attractive because they are not funding for land, they're only funding for the construction. But if tomorrow the rental, the tenants fail to pay, then there has to be some legal recourse for the investor to do it. Otherwise, the investor is not going to hold that rental stock. So in other words, what we have is there are some structural problems. One is availability of land. The other one is high cost of funding. And then the third one is there is no strong legal recourse which are available to landlords. So in the absence of all of these things, creating a sufficient rental housing stock and then being able to solve this problem is going to not happen. In my view, it's not going to happen. So either government creates those houses and then takes it upon themselves to figure this out, or if you want private parties to come in, there has to be some support. Either government provides land or government provides some legal protection in case something happens. And that's the only way it will happen. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but in my mind, rental housing is a good solution, but it is not in the current way, in the current context, not a perfect solution. For the second question, if you can just, I forget what the second question was. If you can just,
so
you were saying about informal sector, right? I mean,
yeah,
basically.
yeah. So basically, the lower income or EWS, which lacks like mostly
the credit. Yeah.
So,
okay.
Yeah,
now
so
I got
credit,
it.
how do you design it? Yeah.
See, this is a problem. Again, this is not unique to India. This is unique to all the countries in the world which have low income informal categories. It is just that we have to figure out how do you separate people who want to pay and who are aspiring for going up the economic ladder versus people who just cannot happen. So, for example, like I'm giving you an example from my personal thing, right? And I don't want to name. We have actually one of our clerical assistant in IIM Bangalore who has opted for an affordable housing of a Karnataka government project. And I had been watching him because he had shared some information about me. So here is somebody who qualifies to be an affordable housing and who could potentially part of that 18 million units that you're talking about, who clearly has the intent to pay and they do have some job security. If you go down to even people like vegetable vendors, many of them, they are now being serviced by fintech companies. If you actually go to any of the new age fintech companies which are offering credit, because these people don't get credit from banks. In fact, many of them have told me that the NPAs from this category is actually very low. It is just that they do a little bit a stronger filter. I'm not saying that it will solve all of the needs. 100% of the people, they are going to get these sort of opportunities. But clearly 20-25% will get it. And they really want to pay. So why don't we first take care of them first? Get them out of that process. Give them homes. At least they are moving up. Then we can figure out what do we do with other people in the category. So the problem in Indian policy is that we always been looking at one size fits all. If you're looking at low income, we are putting everybody in the same category. Even people who want to pay. So the banking policies, the banking rules and regulations, all the things that you're talking about, right, which is very difficult. They ask for income certificate and so on. It is impossible. But there are fintech companies who are able to do it today using other means other than income certificate. So it is just that you need to have some conviction that you need to solve this problem and use data technology to figure out how can I supplement how can I mitigate the risk of providing credit to this category.
Yeah, thank you.
Venki, I don't see other questions from you, but I had a couple of my own.
Sure.
So one is this is something I'd read earlier, that in these low-income housing projects which have been constructed on the outskirts of cities, how do you prevent high-income people from buying those as investments? Which is one of the problems that was seen, that these houses are purchased as investments by people who are not actually low income, and then they leave them unoccupied, waiting for the land price to appreciate. So while you're creating supply, this actually gets utilized for some other reason by other people. That was one. In second, I was wondering about new age business models like Airbnb. Right? So how do they impact housing? So one of the there have been recent studies in the US showing that places or neighborhoods where there's high Airbnb concentration, they increase rental rates in those neighborhoods. And the people who get priced out of then the rental market are the ones who are lower. While the people who are benefiting from Airbnb are people who have the richer ones who have houses which can be given out as Airbnb. So if you have any views on it.
Yeah, the first one is simple, Arpit. The thing is that most of the housing projects that are created on the outskirts, actually, the problem is they are not attractive to people to live in, because most of these people, the economic livelihood is somewhere else. And there is, as I said, no proper infrastructure or transportation options. So in the absence of that, clearly, even if you give me something which is 10 miles away or 20 miles away, I'm not going to take it. But if it is attractive to somebody else, I'm be happy to sell it and go back to where I was before. So the first thing to take care of it in that case is at least try to make these clusters of projects closer to economic clusters, so that then you can see whether this is a genuine problem or this is a problem because you have given an asset which is not of any value to these people. In my mind, I think if you actually do it, and you can see that with many of the industrial clusters, right, that have come up in various parts of the country, you do find that whenever you create affordable housing projects, it does get taken up by people. So now comes the other question, which is, let's say, even if I want to move in there, would I still sell it? Because the price appreciation is significant. So in my mind, that's a simple contractual thing, right? If governments are selling it and there is and governments, let's say in the case of projects where the governments have given long-term leases of land, you can easily contractually ensure that there are no transactions that are taking place. You cannot sell. If you sell, then the recourse goes back to the government or to the original developer. So something like that can happen. And again, I'm giving you legal solutions for which you need a good legal environment to be enforced for enforcement. But it can be done. If there is some serious thought and effort put in by the government, you could create affordable housing projects. And we do have somewhat successful affordable housing projects in different parts of the country, like Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, and so on. So it is just a question of how do you incentivize people to take the house, and making sure that you understand the motives for them to even seek a house. On the second question on Airbnb, see, Airbnb model is that it is depending on people, tourist people to come in, and it raises the rental rates. But my assumption is that is going to not be the Airbnb areas are more likely to be where, the low income housing is not there. So my guess is that if Airbnb is not going to be very attractive in the middle of a slum, for example, right, or very close to a slum. Yeah. So these are two different housing markets. What you are saying is absolutely true for a regular income housing. So there is definitely, if you can increase the rental yields, which is essentially what Airbnb is doing in a very formal way, then clearly increase of rental yields is going to make it very attractive for people to invest in in housing in that place.
Yeah. Thanks, Venki. As of now, I can't see other questions from the audience. I think we can wait a few seconds, and if there's none, I think there's one from Prof.
Sorry, I have to take my video off, right?
Venki, the policy intervention on affordable housing, if you go back and how do you link it to the subprime crisis, because when you go back and look at the subprime crisis, it was marketization of a problem of trying to give much more affordable housing, both in terms of ownership as well as in terms of finances for ownership. And we saw what happened after that. So how much should the markets play a role in this? That's a question.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Sriram. That's a great question. See, in my mind, subprime was largely an enforcement problem, in the sense that both the regulators dropped the ball, the underwriting standards came down dramatically, and nobody was watching it on the initiation side, and then of course on the packaging and the securitization stage also, we did have regulatory lapses in governance. So it's, in my mind, it's largely a governance problem. It could have been easily solved if the governance had stepped up at the right time. So many of those excesses could have been prevented. So in my mind, markets are very critical to solving any problem of this scale, except that the markets on their own cannot solve it. You have to incentivize them in some way. And as I said, in India, having talked to several developers in this space, the incentives have to be either land or funding. And again, funding not by the kind of thing that people have done, right, which is creating an infrastructure status. So that's just a couple of 2 or 3% change in the cost of capital. It's not going to make a big difference. On the other hand, if there is a cost, let's say guarantee, right? Suppose, for example, if they peg the cost to say that any change in cost over time, the excess cost will be borne by the government and not by the developer, so that you can assure the margins in the project, then they know exactly what they're getting in. So right now, the problem for most developers is it's an extremely uncertain game anyway in real estate because of the delays and approval process. And therefore, if you throw on that also changes in cost, and then you prevent them from pricing it out to the customer, then clearly you're just telling them to build with one hand tied. And I don't think that would work even with any kind of incentive that the government throws through on the demand side. So that's why I feel the government, if we want to radically come in and change the game, first they have to put a significant amount of land in the table, and then say, here is a set of developers that you can actually handpick, create a structure that is making sure that the developers have skin in the game. And I'm sure there are a lot of developers would be happy to do this, because as long as they can convert, it's like an annuity business for them, where for a given amount of capital, they can get an assured rate of return. At least they can carve out as another business for them, and many of them would be happy to do it. But today that's not happening. And therefore developers don't come in. There is no supply of housing that is being created. Most governments have stopped supplying. The things like the Karnataka government, where they say they are going to supply, but they're incredibly slow. They are also not seriously interested in supplying. So which means the shortage is only going to go up over time.
I have another question, Venki. This is to do with TDRs, transferable development rights. Where you don't need to put the land on the table, but you're monetizing the rights, which is an interesting way of looking at the market solution for this. But are there inherent larger ecological and sustainability issues? Because the moment you give TDRs, then you're going beyond the allowed FSI, which means that it's going beyond the carrying capacity. Is that a good idea, particularly when you're looking at slum rehabilitation and things like that?
Again, a great question, Sriram. I think so first of all, TDR itself has only worked in a very few states. In many states, TDR is not an attractive option because the market for TDRs have not been robust enough to take this incentive. So, as you rightly said, if I increase the FSI, or if I'm able to increase FSI and create different kind of problems, I think that is an issue. In fact, the classic example is not through TDR, but in Hyderabad, for example, when the government allowed the FSI to freely float without putting a limit to it. So obviously, the first round after the elimination of the cap there was an indiscriminate build out in the city. But then over time, people realize that the infrastructure becomes an enormous pain, so that the pricing starts equilibrating. So which is what's happening now in Hyderabad, where for example, I know some developers in Hyderabad who say that even though I have open FSI, I cannot go beyond 6 or 7. So now the question is, what is the optimal FSI for that infrastructure? That depends. I don't know. As you said, if you are trying to force it in a very dense area where infrastructure is already tapped, then there will be a lot of unintended consequences. But there are multiple areas outside in the growth peripheral of any city which can accommodate the higher TDRs, higher FSIs, and clearly that might benefit the developers. So my guess is that it will have to be very carefully orchestrated by the government to ensure that the TDRs cannot be used up in areas where there would be a greater tax on the environment. And I think that it all depends on the incentives that is being provided to the developer. But I do know that the current FSI is way below norm, so there is still some headroom for the FSIs to go up. At least to that level, they can optimize. And then beyond that, the government can say that you cannot do this, and then push it to the growth. So again, in my mind, if the government was serious about solving this problem, infrastructure development would be one of the primary things the government would be doing. Because without infrastructure development, increase of housing shortage, even if the private developers are willing to put their capital in, is going to be a disaster anyway a few years down the road. So clearly the government, if it wants to solve the housing problem, it has to solve the infrastructure problem either at the same time or first.
So Venki, thanks a lot for the session and for patiently answering our questions.
Sure. Thank you, Arpit and Sriram, for giving me an opportunity. Thank you.